What's up, guys? I'm Chad Barnes, and welcome to the channel. Here, it's all about real car talk, from simple fixes to smart driving tips and keeping your ride in top shape. If that sounds good to you, go ahead and give the video a thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button and make sure you watch all the way through. There's a lot of good stuff coming. Let's get to it.
We told about what EGR is, how this system works, and how it is disconnected in different services in this material. We won't repeat it. Just remind you that the exhaust gas recirculation system is based on feeding a certain amount of exhaust gases into the intake to reduce the content of NOx oxides of nitrogen in the exhaust by reducing the amount of oxygen required for their formation. EGR does not directly affect anything else. This system is in any modern motor that meets Euro 4 and above environmental standards. And all would be nothing, but exhaust gases inevitably bring with them into the intake soot, which is deposited there as a result, of which the EGR valve one day loses mobility and jams. After that, someone flushes the intake, restores the functioning of the system and drives on. And someone prefers to disconnect EGR at all, believing that this way you can solve all the problems of this system at once. Is it really so, and doesn't disabling the EGR system harm the engine? Around this topic, a huge number of misconceptions and prejudices have accumulated, some of which can only cause laughter. However, many people believe any statements made by people speculating on automotive topics. Let us examine the most popular of these misconceptions. To begin with, there is an opinion that soot cannot settle in the intake. It requires oil, which can get there from the turbine or crankcase ventilation system. Yes, oil speeds up this process a lot, but it goes on without it. Soot in the exhaust gases is present in any case and settles in the inlet inevitably. The second important point is how dangerous soot is to the engine. Sometimes there is an opinion that since soot is carbon, it cannot be abrasive, because the same carbon is used to make graphite grease. This is a misconception of pure water. The abrasiveness of soot in internal combustion engines has long been proven, and the results of studies of research clearly indicate that soot has pronounced abrasive properties. However, this is not the main problem. Much worse is a critical reduction in the lubricity of the oil protective film in places of increased load. The matter is that in the mixture of soot and oil, the size of carbon particles grows from 40 to 200 nanometers, and the abrasiveness of such large particles is noticeably higher. In addition, engine oil with soot particles noticeably changes its properties. Viscosity increases, thus reducing its lubricity, surface. Protective films are destroyed, and friction and wear in loaded places increase by multiples. Even 4% soot content in the oil already affects the oil access to the contact zone. It is simply blocked by soot particles. For a more complete illustration, let us cite data obtained on a friction machine. The friction force with oil containing 5% soot by weight increases by 800% at 100 degrees Celsius compared to cold oil. In the case of pure oil, the friction increases by only 50% at the same temperature. The conclusion is obvious. Soot in the oil is much more harmful to the engine than you might think. And the main problem is not that it is deposited on the intake, but that, getting into the oil, it significantly accelerates engine wear. Recall that the task of EGR is to reduce emissions of nitrogen oxides. For some reason, many people believe that there is only one way to do this, to reduce the flashpoint in the combustion chamber. Technically, this is true. The lower the temperature, the lower the NOx content, but only partially. How is this temperature reduction achieved? First of all, by reducing the concentration of oxygen, the oxidizing agent for fuel combustion. At the time when the first recirculation systems appeared on production cars in 1973, there was some sense in lowering the flashpoint. But only for gasoline engines. For them, a slight enrichment of the mixture is a good way to prevent detonation. But now we are talking primarily about diesel engines, in which EGR fails more often. And the recirculation system on gasoline engines is usually implemented differently these days, by overlapping the phases. However, now we are not talking about it. Let's return to diesels. So, EGR reduces the oxygen supply. Does the mixture become so lean after the EGR is turned off that we can talk about engine overheating? Not at all. In the case of a diesel, it is a bit incorrect to talk about a lean or rich fuel-air mixture, but let's imagine at least the order of numbers. Modern diesel engines operate with a strong excess of oxygen. The stoichiometric mixture for them is equal to 1 to 14.5, and in real life the ratio of fuel and air in the working mixture can exceed 140, that is, to be 3 to 4 times more than the stoichiometric value. During recirculation, exhaust gases replace up to 60% of clean air on modern Euro 6 diesels and about 30 to 50% on older engines. It is not difficult to calculate that the mixture in the course of such substitution will not become over-enriched anyway. At the initial ratio of 140, when 50% of air is replaced by exhaust gases, it will be at least 120. And this is in any case a poor mixture, not a rich one, which could somehow significantly lower the temperature. Due to the lower specific heat capacity of exhaust gases, probably, the ignition temperature can be lowered, but only slightly. Therefore, let us repeat once again. The task of EGR is to lower the oxygen content to reduce the formation of nitrogen oxides, not to lower the ignition temperature. If even this does not seem to be a convincing enough argument, there is another one. Let's remember, in what modes and engines with single-circuit EGR recirculation is carried out, only at idle and at load up to 30%. But if recirculation had any serious influence on temperature, it would be logical to run it in quite other modes, assuming high load and temperature. However, this is not done. Moreover, in emergency overheating modes or boundary conditions, for example, according to signals from coolant temperature sensors or head temperature sensor, EGR is never activated. If recirculation could save the engine from overheating, engineers would use such a protection mechanism by all means. But they do not do it for a simple reason. Switching on EGR cannot lower the engine temperature in any way. It would be possible to finish the analysis of this myth, if not for one small but important detail, since the standard disabling of EGR during engine operation according to the manufacturer's algorithms does not affect its temperature. Illiterate disabling in the service can sometimes really lead to overheating. For example, it is possible if EGR is shut off physically, but not disabled programmatically. Or if EGR is disabled both physically and programmatically, but in the firmware it is done crookedly, without taking into account the data that the ECU should read when turning off recirculation. At least it is the airflow through the mass airflow sensor, mass airflow sensor, and its substitution dropout due to recirculation and the corresponding injection volume and injection advance angle. But this is another story. The recirculation system is often attributed properties that it simply does not have. For example, that this system supposedly makes it possible to set earlier injection advance angles without detonation and make the engine run softer. Detonation on a diesel? We will dispense with comments here. As for injection angles, they can be adjusted without recirculation, by adjusting fuel supply and timing. Why do you need EGR for this? Even more strange is the assumption that recirculation makes the engine more economical. Such an effect can only be achieved by increasing engine efficiency, for example, by burning fuel more completely. Recirculation does the opposite. Due to the reduced amount of oxygen, fuel is not burned completely, which is proved by the increased amount of CO, CH, and soot in the exhaust gases, so we cannot talk about fuel efficiency. So can't EGR bring tangible benefits to the engine? It can. With it, the engine really warms up a couple of minutes faster in frosty weather. True, covered with soot, but faster. Should it be switched off or not? It seems that now it is possible to declare with all manly straightforwardness, disconnection of EGR is a necessary thing. But not everything is so unambiguous. First of all, if you are an environmentally conscious person, you cannot live without EGR. This system is really successful in fighting nitrogen oxides, although it increases CO, CH, and soot emissions. Other systems, particulate filter and urea injection, fight with them afterwards, and though this fight is ridiculous and absurd in all its manifestations, someone needs it to keep his sanity. Therefore, we will not take the liberty of recommending to turn off recirculation to everyone. From the point of view of technology, it would be right. From the point of view of morality, not quite. Secondly, even if you decide to disable EGR, you stand a good chance of ruining the engine. Unfortunately, it's not as simple an operation as it sounds, and it's for this reason that many people regret that they ever agreed to it and talk about overheating, consumption, stiff engine performance, and other horrors of disabling EGR. Many offer a solution to the EGR problem, which boils down to a primitive disabling of the errors and closing the duty cycle maps of the recirculation valve. In reality, properly disabling EGR looks different. In any engine in the factory firmware, one way or another there is a mode of engine operation without EGR. Good specialists know how to find this mode in the software by careful study of the factory control unit descriptions. For example, in Funktionsrahmen, frames of operation, bulletins from Bosch and Continental. If the mode is properly enabled, the engine will operate in a completely normal factory mode, but without EGR. In practice, an ideal example of realization of such a solution would be the use of calibrations of the motor software from the Euro -3 version, without EGR, for the version of the same motor for -4 € and higher. This can be found on our Gazelles with Cummins engines, which exist both in -3 € and -5 € versions, or on some Toyota with old units, which were produced for the European market and Arab countries. Sometimes you can simply replace the software with another one from the -3 € version of the same motor, after which the engine will run normally without EGR. However, in this case some other data, which are reflected in the software, for example, VIN, mileage, some individual configuration elements, can be replaced, so it is better to transfer not the whole software, but calibrations from the younger ecological version to the recipient's software. Not many people know how to do it. Another way to enable the factory mode without EGR is to search for a mode in the firmware, in which the operation of the recirculation system is prohibited and the engine operates according to the pre-calibrated maps of operation on clean air from the factory. As a rule, we are talking about engine operation mode number 0, i.e. normal engine operation, not starting, not warming up, not regeneration of particulate filter, not emergency mode. Engine operation mode number 0 has many situations in which recirculation is enabled or disabled. For example, on most ECUs up to -5 €, recirculation is always disabled in so-called gross Einspritzmensch modes or in coolant overheating modes. If during calibration the conditions under which EGR is switched off are set constant, the system will not operate in this mode. However, in other modes, such as regeneration or engine warm-up, or when the turbocharger overpressure is released, as is the case with some PSA and JLR engines, the valve can open as if nothing had happened, on command from the ECU. The most difficult to pull off this operation is on -6 € engines with dual-circuit EGR. The previous tricks may not work there. Here the procedure of disconnection will be a bit more complicated. To make a long story short, knowing the exceptions used by the standard monitoring function, which should disable recirculation under certain conditions, and having detailed factory descriptions, you can always look up from the factory engineers how exactly the corrections are implemented in those modes when EGR is turned off by the monitoring system. By understanding what corrections are made to the air calculation due to EGR substitution, what corrections are applied to the injection, advance angle and fuel quantity, by applying mathematical modeling, it is possible to design correct modes of engine operation without EGR with amazing accuracy. Of course, this work is more complex and requires much more time and skill to study and calculate, but it is also quite feasible. So, let's draw conclusions. The first one will sound like this. It is impossible to disable EGR by simply silencing the valve or disabling errors in the EGR software. In this case, it is just possible that all those unpleasant consequences, which many people are afraid of, will appear. It is not necessary to correct the working cycle maps either, but it is necessary to switch on the engine operation mode in which EGR is never used. In this case, the engine will work exclusively according to factory calibrations and will live happily ever after. Certainly longer than with abrasion in cylinders and engine oil. Well, if internal convictions do not allow to refuse EGR, it is desirable to wash the intake more often and change oil, not once in 10,000 kilometers, but at least once in 7,500. This will at least somehow help to prolong the life of the motor, especially if the car is operated mainly in the city, often works at idle speeds and rarely drives under load. The editorial board thanks the company Laboratory of Speed for informational support in the preparation of the material. In conclusion, disabling the exhaust gas recirculation system can lead to significant consequences for your engine's performance and longevity. While it may initially seem beneficial in terms of power and efficiency, the risks of detonation, overheating, and the accumulation of harmless soot can outweigh these advantages. It's crucial to weigh the potential impacts on your vehicle's health and emissions before making such modifications. Always consider consulting with a professional to ensure that your engine operates optimally and remains within legal emission standards. Thank you for watching, and stay informed about your vehicle's needs.